Entire Stone Age landscapes now lie underwater, not metaphorically, not in the loose way people use the word lost, I mean literally, beneath ordinary coastal water, beneath ferry routes and fishing grounds and tourist bays, beneath places where children swim in summer and container ships pass without slowing. There are former shorelines, camps, wells, graves, worked timber, walls, pathways, and in a few rare cases entire settlement plans. We know this, marine archaeologists know it, quaternary geologists know it, the published literature knows it, and yet the broader story of human history is still told, almost reflexively, from the fraction of the old world that stayed dry. I kept returning to that because the implication is larger than the individual sites. And if sea level at the last glacial maximum stood roughly 120 metres lower than today, then immense tracts of the most habitable real estate available to early coastal populations are now gone from ordinary view, hidden by geography, preserved in some places by silt, torn apart in others by currents, trawling, dredging and time. What unsettles me is not that this is unknown. It is that it's treated as a side note, as if the drowning of whole inhabited landscapes were only a complication, not a structural problem for everything we think we know about the rise of settled life. Once I started reading the primary reports, the pattern became difficult to set aside. Off Israel, off Greece, in the Solent, in the Black Sea Basin, off Gujarat, the record keeps producing the same quiet fact. People built at shorelines that no longer exist, and the sea took the coordinates away. These discoveries do get reported, usually in specialist literature few people read, but they are reported as curiosities, not as a challenge to the way we narrate prehistory itself. The mainstream credibility of this subject is not in doubt. Ehud Galilee of the Israel Antiquities Authority and the University of Haifa documented submerged prehistoric sites along the Carmel coast. John Henderson and Chrysanthi Gallu with the University of Nottingham, the British School at Athens, and the Hellenic Ministry of Culture returned serious archaeological attention to Pavlopetri. The Maritime Archaeology Trust has monitored Boldner Cliff since 1999. Woods Hole oceanographers and Black Sea specialists have argued over flood scales with sediment cores and delta stratigraphy, not with television narration. UNESCO has had a convention on the protection of the underwater cultural heritage since 2001 because the material is real, vulnerable, and globally significant. This is textbook territory. Atlit Yam, south of Haifa, is a submerged pre-pottery Neolithic sea settlement lying roughly 300 to 500 metres offshore and 8 to 12 metres below sea level, dated to roughly 9,250 to 8,160 years before present. Pavlopetri was identified in 1967 and mapped in 1968 as a submerged town with buildings, courtyards, streets, chamber tombs, and at least 37 cist graves. Boldner Cliff preserves a Mesolithic paleosol dated to about 8,000 years before present. The Israeli record alone lists 23 submerged prehistoric sites spanning from the Middle Paleolithic to the Pottery Neolithic and Early Chalcolithic. So these are catalogued archaeological contexts, and the scholarship surrounding them is sober to the point of caution. The papers are full of calibration curves, bathymetry, sedimentation rates, taphonomic warnings, typological debates, and very careful phrasing about what can and cannot be inferred. That caution is appropriate. I do not object to it. What I object to is the way the caution seems to halt curiosity exactly where things become most historically consequential. We acknowledge the drowned settlements. We map them. We publish them. Then far too often, we file them back into specialty literature and continue telling the public a land-based origin story for civilization. The difficulty is not absence of data. It is what we choose not to do with it. The anomaly, as I see it, is simple. That we all accept that post-glacial sea level rise inundated vast coastal lowlands that humans had occupied for millennia. We all accept that people are attracted to estuaries, lagoons, river mouths, freshwater springs, sheltered bays, and maritime corridors. We all accept that early settlement, exchange, ritual, and subsistence clustered around exactly those environments. And yet when underwater archaeology confirms that these drowned zones contain organised human life, we continue to speak as though the surviving dry land record is broadly representative of the whole. I want to stay with that for a moment. Off the Mediterranean coast of Israel alone, archaeologists have recorded 23 submerged prehistoric sites. That is one coastline, one national research tradition, one narrow slice of the Eastern Mediterranean, 23. Before I move on, I think this deserves to be held. Because if a single stretch of coast can produce that density of submerged evidence, then the real anomaly is not that drowned settlements exist. The anomaly is that our inherited story of the Neolithic still behaves as though the surviving terrestrial archive is the archive. It is not. It is the remnant. The standard explanation is that this is unsurprising. Sea levels rose, coastal sites drowned, preservation is patchy, underwater excavation is expensive, therefore these finds are important but limited windows into a much larger lost zone. All of that is valid. None of it closes the question. If anything, it opens it wider. Because once we admit that the most attractive coastal real estate of the early Holocene is now offshore, but we also have to admit that the apparent distribution of early settlement complexity may be partly an artifact of what the ocean spared us, not a complete reflection of what once existed. This does not mean there were empires under every bay. It means something more methodologically serious. The absence of evidence on land cannot be read with the same confidence once we know how much evidence is no longer on land. Some innovations in seafaring, exchange, mortuary practice, ritual life, and settlement planning may have taken place in places now invisible to ordinary archaeology. Later flood traditions therefore sit in a changed evidentiary atmosphere. Not proven, not vindicated, changed. I kept resisting that conclusion because I know how quickly this territory attracts people who want to leap from one submerged wall to Atlantis. But the opposite error is just as corrosive. The opposite error is to bury a real anomaly beneath procedural caution until the anomaly no longer disturbs anyone. When serious archaeologists tell us that some of the best preserved prehistoric organic materials in the world are coming from drowned settlements, I do not think the responsible response is to nod politely and move on. I think the responsible response is to ask how much of the human story now lies in the wrong medium. Atlit Yam is where that question stopped being abstract for me. The settlement lies beneath the Mediterranean off the Carmel coast, but it does not present as a vague scatter. It has architecture, a stone-lined well, burials, animal remains, botanical remains, and tools in flint, bone, and stone. It shows a community already committed to farming, fishing, and animal husbandry. It was a place. And then there is the burial. A young woman, estimated at about 25 years old, and an infant, estimated at around 12 months, were buried together in dark clay at Atlit Yam. The bones are generally well preserved. The infant's skull carries serpentine markings on the inner cranial surface associated with thoracic inflammation. The tubular bones show hypertrophic osteoarthropathy. The woman's tibia shows a periosteal reaction consistent with the same disease complex. Ancient DNA and lipid biomarkers later confirmed tuberculosis in both individuals, the earliest confirmed human cases known when the study was published. But it is not only the pathology that stays with me, it is the setting. These two bodies were laid down in a living coastal settlement, hid in a world where the spring was fresh and the houses were dry, and now they exist in the scholarly record as a mother and child from beneath the sea. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. What was this for? What kind of historical memory survives when a burial ground becomes seabed? At Atlit Yam, there is also the problem of intention. The site includes a megalithic installation near a freshwater spring, a semicircle of large stones around the freshwater access, ritual use, communal gathering, symbolic marking. Each explanation is reasonable. None exhausts the image. A community placed heavy stones around freshwater at a shoreline that no longer exists. Before moving forward, this deserves attention. Atlit Yam is not valuable because it confirms a fantasy. It is valuable because it confirms a loss. Boldnor Cliff, in the Solent near the Isle of Wight, sharpens the point in a different way. This site lies about 11 metres underwater and preserves a Mesolithic land surface dated to roughly 8,000 years before present. The Maritime Archaeology Trust has reported worked timbers, flint debitage, and a site so vulnerable to erosion that in its own stark wording every year more of it is destroyed. Then came the sedimentary ancient DNA study published in Science, evidence of wheat, or a close relative, appearing there about 2,000 years before the first documented farmers in Britain. Robin Allaby and colleagues did not claim an agricultural revolution in Mesolithic England. They made the narrower, yet more careful point that sophisticated social networks may have linked the Neolithic front in southern Europe to Mesolithic peoples in the north long before farming fully arrived. How many other early exchange systems have already drowned beyond the reach of the standard map? I want to sit with that before moving on. The old caricature of prehistory imagines isolated pockets slowly inventing things in place. Boldnor Cliff does not support that. It suggests contact, transfer, movement, or at least the circulation of goods or knowledge across larger networks than the public narrative prefers, and it suggests this from a sealed submerged sediment layer. Pavlopetri off the coast of southern Laconia adds urban form to the pattern. Nick Fleming first identified the ruins in 1967, and a Cambridge team surveyed them in 1968 and recorded a prehistoric town covering roughly 300 by 150 metres in shallow water, with at least 15 buildings, courtyards, streets, 2 chamber tombs, and at least 37 cysgraves. Pottery, obsidian and chert blades, and a bronze figurine suggested occupation from the early to late Bronze Age. The University of Nottingham project later used digital mapping and targeted excavation to refine the picture, but the essential fact was already there in the 1960s, an organised town plan lying under the sea. What does it do to our sense of historical normality when a town grid survives better underwater than many sites do on land? The other fact about Pavlopetri is almost harder to absorb. After it was first mapped in 1968, and no further archaeological work was carried out there until the return project that began in 2009. 41 years. How does a site like that wait 4 decades? Then there is the Black Sea, where the debate itself has become a kind of burial layer. William Ryan and Walter Pittman made the catastrophic case in the 1990s. Mediterranean waters overtopping the Bosphorus, rapid inundation, drowned settlements, a possible echo behind later flood traditions. Robert Ballard and others went looking. A 1999 science report described plans to survey off Sinop after preliminary sonar had revealed shapes deemed too large for a shipwreck and too regularly shaped not to be man-made. Later work by Liviu Giosan and colleagues at Woods Hole and the University of Bucharest argued for a smaller event than Ryan and Pittman proposed, reducing the flood from the scale of 70,000 square kilometres of inundated land to something more like 2,000. That revision mattered. But notice what it did not do. It did not erase drowning. It did not erase displacement. It did not erase the archaeological question. Why did a reduced flood suddenly make the drowned shoreline problem feel less urgent? And finally I come, carefully, to Dwarka, not the Gulf of Kambat claims, which I find too methodologically unstable to lean on, but the more circumscribed marine archaeology off Dwarka on the Gujarat coast. S.R. Rao and later investigators from the National Institute of Oceanography reported submerged structural remains, and a 2001 study described 20 stone anchors found at depths of 10 to 14 metres in a submerged channel near the site. Though the dating of those anchors was explicitly treated as problematic because some anchor types range from the 3rd millennium BCE to the modern period. That caution matters. I want to be fair to it. But alongside that caution sits a textual memory from the Mausala Parva of the Mahabharata, in Kem Ganguly's translation, where Krishna says of Dwaravati, "This city of Dwaravati, after Arjuna's departure, will, with its walls and edifices, be swallowed up by the ocean without any delay." What exactly are we supposed to do with that when the seabed nearby does, in fact, contain a submerged archaeological problem? When I stack these cases together, what disturbs me is not that each one can be explained. Sea level rise, subsidence, erosion, sediment cover, later textual embellishment, ritualized memory, trade without colonization. An ordinary caution, each explanation is valid. The deeper issue is that all of them still point in the same direction. Human life accumulated at coasts. Coasts drowned. The archive followed them down. Once that becomes visible, the anomaly stops being local. It becomes global. Mesopotamia gives it language. In Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim does not speak of an abstract flood detached from place. He speaks of a city. There was an ancient city, Shuruppak, on the banks of the Euphrates. The gods in heaven decided in their council to bring the flood down on the fortunate city. That is not a geological report, and I'm not treating it as one, but structurally it is doing something very precise. It ties catastrophic inundation to a named inhabited place, and it frames survival as the preservation of memory after the destruction of a settlement. That is the same function that later underwater archaeology keeps materializing in another register. People at water's edge, a rupture, and a remainder. India gives the same structure in a different textual system. The Mausala Parva does not merely speak of divine punishment or cyclical destruction. It names Dwaravati and specifies walls and edifices swallowed by the ocean. Offshore exploration near Dwarka then turns up submerged contexts, stone anchors, and structural claims that archaeologists continue to debate. Again, I am not collapsing text into proof, I am noticing the logic. Named place, maritime edge, submergence, cultural pull, memory that refuses to forget the site even when its chronology becomes contested. Northern Europe gives us the physical counterpart without the epic frame. Doggerland, the drowned expanse of the southern North Sea, once linked Britain to the continent. Fishing nets and dredges have brought up bone and antler spear points, axes, adzes, butchered animal bones, a perforated pick made from an aurochs leg bone, and the jawbone and teeth of a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer dated to around 8,300 years ago. The famous Kalinda harpoon, about 8.5 inches long, rose from a lump of dredge sediment before anyone fully understood the scale of the landscape it represented. There is no classical text attached to Doggerland, no priestly archive, no royal inscription. What remains instead is the artifact trail of a populous world that once existed where ships now cross open water. What else did Doggerland take with it when it went down? And then Australia forces the pattern into a register that most conventional histories are still uncomfortable with. Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed compiled Aboriginal oral traditions from 21 coastal locations around the continent that remember former dry land later inundated by the sea. In the Wellesley Islands tradition, as they summarised it, the home islands were once part of a peninsula, and people moved freely across them, until Garngur, the seagull woman, dragged a raft across the neck and let the sea pour in, making islands where there had been connected land. In the Tarawal memory of Botany Bay reported by Francis Bodkin, the returning elders find that what had been swampy ground has become an inlet, and that Georges River and Cook's River are no longer one. In traditions from the Naranga people of York Peninsula, there was once no Spencer's Gulf, only marshy country with freshwater lagoons before the sea entered and remained. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? Not the same gods, not the same cosmology, not the same language family, not the same continent. Yet the same underlying narrative mechanism keeps appearing. Formerly inhabited or traversed land at the coastal margin becomes sea. The transformation is remembered as a collective rupture, and place memory survives long after the geography has changed. That does not prove a single shared event. It suggests that human societies repeatedly experienced the drowning of meaningful places and then built durable cultural forms to hold the loss. As I discussed it before in a previous piece on deep time memory, though once a culture encodes landscape change into story, the story can outlast the landscape itself. That possibility matters here because underwater archaeology is no longer dealing only with myth on the one side and evidence on the other. It is dealing with situations where material loss and cultural memory may be brushing against each other across enormous spans of time. Even the disagreements strengthen the pattern. Consider Doggerland and the Storegga tsunami. Earlier accounts like the dramatic version, one catastrophic wave ending the last Great North Sea plain in a single stroke. More recent work argues that much of Doggerland was already submerged before the tsunami and that impact severity varied across the region. Fine, but again notice what survives the correction. The land still drowned. Human occupation still existed there. The coastlines people knew still disappeared. The adjustment is about mechanism and tempo, not about whether a lived world was lost. The same is true in the Black Sea. Even when Gyosan and colleagues cut the flood scenario down from biblical scale, they still describe 2,000 square kilometres of prime agricultural land inundated. That is not nothing. It is an entire human problem. Scale revisions often calm the public long before they resolve the historical question. 60 metres becomes 10, 70,000 square kilometres becomes 2,000, and suddenly people behave as though the archaeology has ceased to matter. But for the people on the vanishing shore, the distinction between dramatic and merely massive may not have felt like the one later literature makes, which I have covered in a previous video on flood memory. Yet the real issue is not whether every tradition is literally accurate in every detail. The issue is whether repeated human encounters with marine transgression left stronger traces in culture than our disciplinary silos are prepared to admit. When a Yidinji tradition remembers ancestors living where the Great Barrier Reef now stands, when Gilgamesh names Shurapak before the deluge, when Dwaravati is remembered with walls and edifices swallowed by the ocean, and when underwater surveys from Israel to Britain keep turning up settlements on drowned coasts, I do not think the intellectually serious response is to snicker at flood myths and move on. I think we should ask why the same structural memory keeps reappearing wherever the shore moved fastest, as there are legitimate reasons this field has not been investigated at the scale it deserves. Underwater archaeology is costly, permits are difficult, good visibility is rare, organic preservation is unpredictable, political geography matters, the Black Sea touches zones shaped by Turkish jurisdiction, Romanian research budgets, and wider instability. Eastern Mediterranean work has had to navigate military coastlines, salvage priorities, and modern development pressures. Funding tends to favour sites that can deliver clean results quickly, not submerged prehistoric landscapes that require boats, dive teams, conservation labs, and years of patient mapping before a public-friendly conclusion appears. I do not dismiss any of that. The WHOI Black Sea work was funded by the US, her National Science Foundation and Romanian National Science Foundation. Boldnor Cliff has depended on long-term institutional persistence and at times European funding structures such as Interreg. Pavla Petri required collaboration with the Hellenic Ministry of Culture and the British School at Athens. Atlit Yam research drew on decades of local expertise. This is hard work in hard environments, but those reasons are not enough. Pavla Petri waited from 1968 to 2009 for renewed archaeological investigation, 41 years. Boldnor Cliff has been monitored since 1999 under conditions in which, by the Maritime Archaeology Trust's own account, every year more of the site is destroyed. Off Israel, 23 submerged prehistoric sites are already recorded, and the literature explicitly says they are among the best preserved underwater settlements in the world, preserving plant materials, basketry, wood, human and animal remains, and artifacts that dryland sites often cannot retain. Yet submerged prehistoric archaeology still sits at the edges of the public story of early human settlement, treated as a specialist niche rather than a central evidentiary frontier. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling. What I see is a collective failure of narrative adjustment. Institutions can accommodate the data without letting the data reorganize the story. A submerged site becomes a paper. The paper becomes a citation. The citation becomes a background footnote in another paper. And the general account remains basically intact. Villages on land, towns on land, exchange on land, ritual on land, the sea as backdrop rather than archive. Nobody has to lie for that to happen. Nobody has to hide artifacts in a basement. All that is required is a scholarly culture comfortable with treating the drowned margin as supplementary. There is also the problem of disciplinary division. Marine geologists work on sea level curves. Archaeologists work on culture history. Epigraphers work on texts. Oral historians work on tradition. Funding panels ask narrow questions because narrow questions are easier to score. The result is that the one question that disturbs the whole picture rarely gets asked with enough force. How much of early coastal social development is permanently missing from the dryland synthesis? That is a research design question with consequences many textbooks still seem unwilling to absorb, and meanwhile the sites keep degrading. Sand mining off Israel accelerates exposure and loss. Pollution and ship traffic threaten Pavla Petri. Currents eat Boldnor Cliff. The seafloor does not wait for our historiography to catch up. So let me say clearly what I am not claiming. I am not saying Atlantis has been found. I am not claiming every flood story is a literal historical transcript. I am not saying the debated archaeology off Dwarka or the Black Sea proves a single global catastrophe remembered uniformly by all peoples. What I am saying is that mainstream archaeological and geological research already demonstrates beyond any reasonable dispute that multiple inhabited prehistoric and ancient coastal landscapes were submerged by post-glacial sea level rise and related marine processes, and that these drowned contexts preserve evidence substantial enough to challenge the completeness of any history written only from surviving land. That is a narrower claim than some people want. It is also harder to dismiss. Atlit Yam is real, Pavla Petri is real, Boldnor Cliff is real, Doggerland's artifact trail is real. The 23 submerged prehistoric sites off Israel are real. The Black Sea Basin flood debate is real, even where its most dramatic versions have been corrected. Aboriginal Australian coastal inundation traditions are real and published by mainstream scholars. The question is what kind of historical humility they require from us. And I find that a more unsettling position than any grand theory, because it removes the comfort of easy extremes. I cannot honestly say the alternative history crowd is vindicated. I also cannot honestly say the orthodox story is untouched. Something important has already been admitted into the record. We just have not allowed ourselves to live with the consequences of the admission. Why, if drowned shorelines were predictable archaeological targets all along, did it take so long for them to become more than occasional sidebars? What social network carried wheat to Boldnor Cliff 2,000 years before farming reached Britain? The record does not tell us why a mapped town like Pavlopetri could wait 41 years for renewed work, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Who kept the coordinates alive? What, exactly, was the relationship between Atlit Yam's freshwater installations, its burials, and the sea that later took the settlement? Why does a smaller Black Sea flood estimate seem to calm the historical imagination when 2,000 square kilometres of drowned agricultural land is still a civilizational fact? What are we meant to do with Krishna's warning that Dwaravati, with its walls and edifices, would be swallowed by the ocean when the marine archaeology offshore remains suggestive yet unresolved? The record does not tell us enough. Salt water moves over bone and stone. Under the Mediterranean off the Carmel coast, the woman from Atlit Yam still lies in the literature beside the child. But what the papers cannot fully transmit is the physical intimacy of the image. And two human beings placed carefully in a settlement that expected sunrise over dry ground, a spring nearby, houses nearby, illness in the bone, then centuries, then millennia, then the shoreline gone, the floor of the village lowered beneath green water, and modern divers descending through light to find not a legend, but a burial that had simply stayed where history left it. The first time I saw the excavation photographs, I remember feeling that strange combination of precision and displacement that only archaeology can produce. The details are clinical, the age estimates, the lesions, the sediment description, the confirmed tuberculosis biomarkers, and yet the scene itself resists clinical distance. You are looking at a domestic human tragedy that happened in a place now outside the ordinary map of habitation. That the sea did not make it mystical. The sea made it harder for later history to hold. That, I suspect, is why this subject keeps pulling serious researchers and unserious speculators into the same gravitational field. The material is real enough to trouble certainty, but incomplete enough to invite projection. My own position, after months of sitting with the papers, is less dramatic and more difficult. Entire chapters of early coastal human life were not marginal at all. They were central. And because they were central, their loss has distorted the archive more profoundly than our public histories usually admit. I do not know whether any single submerged site will ever force a rewrite dramatic enough to satisfy people who want a revelation. History rarely works that way. More often it changes by accumulation, though by one careful report leaning against another until the old frame no longer quite holds. A burial under the Mediterranean, a town grid off Laconia, wheat DNA under the Solent, a Mesolithic jaw from the North Sea, a tradition in Australia remembering a peninsula turned to islands, a text from Mesopotamia naming a city before the flood, another from India remembering walls and edifices taken by the sea. Each case can be contained. Together they are harder to contain. And so I end where I began, not with certainty but with a physical fact. The drowned landscapes are there. Some are mapped. Some are eroding now. Some are still sealed under sediment. Some are known only because a trawler or storm or dredge tore open a little piece of them. And somewhere in that offshore archive are people we have not counted, routes we have not traced, and inventions we have not placed, and losses we have not fully respected. What lies offshore is not Atlantis and not nothing, but a human past sitting in plain water, waiting for language.